from beginning. Okay, can you see?
There you go. Lovely. It's light and bright and clear.
Okay, great. So I have prepared a very modest presentation. I hope it's okay for the purpose. The motto of your conference is about the role, the contribution that philosophy, particularly Nusantara philosophy, can play in the post-COVID situation. I think it can play a very big role. It has played a very big role historically in Indonesia and beyond in the transformation, the cultural transformation that took place in the last decades. And I think a part of this contribution that Nusantara philosophy can have now is looking back to previous contributions that it had and previous debates that were there in earlier decades. Particularly in the 1970s. Here I have a few book titles that are representing parts of what I'm going to talk about. Mochtalubis, Manusia Indonesia, 1977, the famous speech in Jakarta, then republished many times in many different covers. Alfian, Transformasi Sosial Budaya dalam Pembangunan Nasional. Then, of course, the famous quote by Sultan Takhtir Ali Shahbana, Jangan tangisi tradisi. Here's an edition of 1994 talking about this take of Sultan Takhtir Ali Shahbana. And then the late Abdurrahman Wahid, who also published a book about Islam Cosmopolitan, Nilai-Nilai Indonesia Transformasi Kebudayaan, which is a collection of speeches and contributions of Gus Dur over the decades starting in the 1970s. So you see there is a wider range of streams, of currents, of thought that have to do with cultural transformation. But I think that the 1970s are of particular interest. Now, I would like to start, coming from humanity, I would like to start with something that is awkward, that is weird, that is interesting. Namely, here is my quote. My quote is from Professor E.U. Kratz, who happened to get his Ph.D. in Frankfurt, and then he was a lecturer at Universitas Indonesia in the 1970s, collected a lot of books there, and then he was for more than 30 years at SOAS, London, at the end as a professor, is now teaching in Frankfurt because he moved back to where he came from. In 1991, I did research in the library of Professor E.U. Kratz in London, his private home, on Mochtalubis. And he said, he has a lot of stuff. And here's the quote, the strange quote. And please excuse my German quotation marks. I could not fix them to the English side or in the entire PowerPoint. So the quote is as follows. Here are the shelves with the Indonesian novels. Here with the Malay ones. Here is poetry from Indonesia. Here from Malaysia and Brunei. And here is a strange group of books from Indonesia about culture. I call this group Budaya. There are almost no books from Malaysia and Brunei that would fit into that category. Strange finding. Now, let's get into this Budaya collection and see what it is all about. I have 3 research questions. When did the Indonesian debates about Budaya as modernisasi Budaya occur? Were there any increases or decreases of popularity of the topic over the time? Second question, what were the main themes discussed with the terms modernisasi, or was there anything about pembaruan, and transformasi budaya? And 3, the transformasi budaya deeply affects ontology, cosmology, rationality, religion. What are the links to the field of Nusantara philosophy? My sample starts with the Kratz collection, which is about 9,200 books, 80% of them in Indonesian or Malay. After Professor Kratz retired and I became professor in Frankfurt, we acquired his collection in 2013, so it's now in our library, and our guests and fellows can use them, also students, of course, too. But this is only a part of the sample. This is only the physical access. I then did a systematic search at WorldCat. Of course, we know that all. This is more than 10,000 library catalogs around the world that are sharing their catalog data. And so with the WorldCat, you can see roughly what was published, in what year, and who holds it, and where you can get it. Methods, of course, various searches on WorldCat, combined with a close reading of the printed books. My search terms are always the same, so I have a consistent sample. It's always about keyword Indonesia, title modernisasi, or title pembaruan, or title transformasi budaya. And then I refine to printed books, no book chapters, no microfiches, no journal articles, and I combine that with a quantitative and a qualitative analysis. This selection of printed books only has advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage is, I'm aware there are many journal articles or other texts from newspapers, for instance, or oral communication, where you have modernisasi being used outside of my sample of printed books. So the real use of the terms is much wider than what I can find in printed books. However, if I have the limitation to printed books, it's easier to manage in research, and I also can tell a little bit where the peak of the discussion was. Because if authors decide to put, for instance, modernisasi budaya into the title of their book, and the publisher accepts that, then it is an important topic at the time. So that's the limitation of the study. What did I find? I found a lot of books in the library, and I made a graph, a big bibliography. Then per year, I counted how many book publications are there with the title Modernisasi. And then I transformed that into an Excel graph, so using some quantitative approach there. And this shows you that here from year 0, 1945, onwards, the term Modernisasi was rarely used in Indonesia. There were some occurrences like Modernisasi Pertanian or Modernisasi Islam, pretty early on, 1951, 1964. But then you have a peak of the use of the term Modernisasi in the early years of the New Order. So Modernisasi, you can link as a key term of the New Order debates and discussions. Then the use gets falls down, basically. 10, 15 years later, you have another peak here, when you have a lot of laporan, dampak modernisasi pada hubungan kekerabatan di provinsi XYZ. Indonesia also back then had a lot of provinces. And so you have a lot of reports about unintended effects of modernization on family relations in the various provinces of Indonesia. That's this peak here. And then you see the further use of modernisasi is not so great until it comes here to the modernisasi years, the reformasi years, where reformasi and modernisasi was used in a similar vein, also for modernisasi Islam or modernisasi pesantren. But as you can see, from 2010 on, here's the last peak until before the COVID crisis hit us all, the use of the term modernisasi has been steadily declining. It's still there. You will still find book publications with modernisasi every now and then, but it's getting out of fashion, more or less. So sum up, modernisasi is a key term of the early New Order, a foundational term of the New Order, including about 10, 15 years later. And it has been, since in the Reformasi years, also used in a wider sense for modernisasi Islam or modernisasi pesantren. Now, if you look at the individual book publications, one of the prominent authors is Rosihan Anwar, here to the right, a journalist who was very active in the early New Order phase, but he lived, of course, longer. And here on the left, you see a book that was very influential in global studies of economics of development. Walt Rostow, an American author and advisor to President Nixon in the Vietnam War, by the way. His book from 1960 is The Stages of Economic Growth, where it talks about the traditional society, the preconditions for takeoff, the drive to maturity, and the age of high mass consumption. And this book became highly influential in the World Bank, in the International Monetary Fund, in economics of development at large in many governments around the world who wanted to modernize with a plan. And they followed more or less this model of the 5 stages of growth. From Indonesia, you have authors such as Rosihan Anwar, Gerakan Mahasiswa Kristen Indonesia, Studi Klub Mahasiswa Indonesia. So you have the New Order Kami and Kapi, 1966, the young people, the young intellectuals who used it. Nurcholish Majid used it, Harsoyo, Bahtiar Rifai, Tatang Natsir, TB Simatupang, and also Ali Murtopo. You can tell from the book publications, for instance, from this one, Laporan Menjelang Take-Off Modernisasi Desa dalam Pelaksanaan Pelita Perikanan Laut, from 1971, you can take that the term take-off in the beginning was used in the English form. Hence, it's very clear that there is a link to the economics of development. So you see here that they use this term take-off, which is also take-off, part of the theory by Walt Rostov. And it is also often featured in the speeches by President Suharto. He also says, of course, not the take-off, but he says, menuju era tinggalandas, quite often in his speeches. So it was part of the promise of the New Order and the strategy of long-term development, and at least 5 times 5 years of Repelita to achieve this age of high mass consumption, to become a fully developed country at the end, after 25 years. Step by step, alon-alon asal kelakon, step by step. So here you have the main inspiration, and this is maybe already a hint why we find a lot about modernisasi in the Indonesian discourse, because the New Order government started its long-term transformation of Indonesia based on this theory. And talking back to Professor Kratz, Malaysia did not do the same thing in the same way. Malaysia also followed a current of the theory of modernization, but more the current of knowledge society and knowledge economy, where you can jump to the final stage by introducing computer technology right away. While the Indonesian model was step by step by step by step, stage by stage. So that is the main difference. That's why you have a lot of discussion about modernisasi and transformasi budaya in Indonesia, and maybe not so much in Malaysia in the same way, because the theory that was behind the government strategy was different. We have not only the Western influence, we also have the Islamic current. Let's not forget that. An example is Nurcholish Majid, quite active, of course, in HMI, Himpunan Mahasiswa Islam, with his famous book, Modernisasi adalah rasionalisasi, bukan westernisasi, Bandung, 1968. So here he refers to the concept of rationalization, referring to Talcott Parsons, another American scholar of modernization theory, who already in 1930 translated Max Weber's books from German into English, and then built on Max Weber's theory his own further theories of rationalization and modernization. However, Nurcholish Majid not only refers to this Western, German-American kind of take, but he also refers to Islamic discussions and debates about modernization, including Muhammad Abduh and Ahmad Dahlan. In Yogyakarta, of course, Ahmad Dahlan is very famous. Everybody knows that there is a debate about modernization within Muhammadiyah very early on, and earlier than Talcott Parsons would write his contributions about modernization. So saying we have the Western background and we have the Islamic background for this modernisasi project. Let's look at the transformasi budaya. Here I have created a graph where I combine the modernisasi, it's the graph that we just saw, and then about 20 years after the modernisasi discourse got so strong, we have an add-on. It changes, it switches, it transforms itself. There comes a new keyword, which is not only modernisasi, but transformasi budaya, which is a very deep concept. And we have book publications on transformasi budaya every year almost since. For instance, Dakwah Islam dan Transformasi Sosial Budaya from 1985. Alfian, as mentioned, Transformasi Sosial Budaya dalam Pembangunan Nasional. So the New Order project was about transforming the culture deeply. We have dissident intellectuals such as Mokhtar Lubis, who were criticizing parts of the development in his book Transformasi Budaya untuk Masa Depan from 1988. Intellectuals such as Umar Khayyam, Transformasi Budaya Kita, or LIPI, Industrialisasi dan Perubahan Sosial, Transformasi Nilai-Nilai Sosial Budaya menuju Masyarakat Industri Studi Kasus di Provinsi Jawa Timur, 1990. So almost every year you have the Transformasi Budaya in a book title as an important part of the discussion. And you can tell it starts in 1985. It has a peak in the Reformation period, and it gets less in the last 10 years before Corona, which is also interesting. So apparently, as a historical phenomenon, this cultural transformation was particularly a topic of intellectual discourse in the 1980s, 1990s, before it then ended in the Reformation or Reformasi discourse. Example, Mokhtar Lubis. He, as you might know, of course, is Mandailing, educated with modernist Islamic as well as modern secular ideas. His book on Berkelana dalam Rimba from 1980 is a youth novel. It's the first Indonesian novel to propagate the protection of the hutan rimba. This is a very important book, actually, if you want to think about the green movement, the history of the green movement in Indonesia. And it means double green. It means also Islamic takes on the protection of the environment. You would have to go to Berkelana dalam Rimba, and then you can compare it to the earlier version, the earlier novel, which is Penyamun dalam Rimba from 1972, which is not yet this outspoken. So this Transformasi Budaya idea is much deeper and much more present in the Berkelana dalam Rimba than you have it in the Penyamun dalam Rimba. So there was a change in the ideas of Mokhtar Lubis in the 1970s. And he also became outspoken in essays, non-fictional essays, for instance, in Selamatkan Hutan in Horizon, 1980. In 1988, he then himself argues for deep cultural change without fiction. Now, if you hear the conference, where most of us here are studying some sort of philosophy, of course, that means that with this kind of deep transformation, there is a very key, very central role for philosophy, the Sahara philosophy, for cultural studies, sociology, of course, literature studies, economics, political science, you name it. It is related because the project of the New Order and similar development projects in Southeast Asia transformed the culture and the societies and economies deeply. So all fields were affected. And it's quite interesting that we can put these things together in one perspective. If you focus a little bit more into Mokhtar Lubis, I published a small book about him in 1995 in German, so nobody read it. Some points here. About Mokhtar Lubis, he already in the 1960s advocated critical thinking, rationality, for instance, in his Harimau, which also can be read as a criticism of President Sukarno, but also about tahayul and superstition. In the 1970s, Mokhtar Lubis develops his approach further to a new cosmology within Islam, and particularly in this book, Berkelana dalam Rimba. Now, what happens is, if you're no longer believing in tahayul or in the spirits in the world, especially the spirits in the forest is no longer keramat. Human beings have a very direct relation to God and also to the creation. At the same time, human beings have a new rationality, and this leads to an empowerment, a liberation and an empowerment for the role of humans in the world. It makes them strong. Their agency is much bigger. However, since this is a relation or a development within Islam, it is paired with a sense of responsibility, of being in charge of the creation. So it comes with a new responsibility. That's the message here. And if you are changing the basic ontologies, the basic ontological concepts in the world and how you perceive the world, then it is, of course, of the greatest interest for all sorts of philosophy. And I find similar thoughts in many of the contributions from the 70s and 80s, getting into this new kind of ontological positioning within the world. This is the basis of a scientific exploration of the world. So that's the link also to scientific exploration in our universities. And at the same time, it advocates a new aesthetics of wild nature. This is something that is interesting because also wild nature in other parts of the world was not always considered to be beautiful. For instance, the cold and dark and windy North Sea was considered to be a terrible space for most of the history, until the 19th century, when the Romantic authors described for the first time how beautiful the ugly North Sea is, with its cold winds. Prior to that, everybody would think, how ugly. Well, maybe the Mediterranean is a nice place, but not the North Sea. So wild nature has a history of being described as beautiful over time. It's not always the same. And what happens here, in the case of Mortelubis, he expands the places within nature that can be considered beautiful. And that is a new take on literature. You can aestheticize the forest. But also on painting, on the arts, on music. It has a whole new category. So in a way, my very modest interpretation of Mortelubis was he's, in my perspective, a little bit advocating an axis age, translating the term by Karl Jaspers, axis age. Jaspers referred to the transformation in the ontological concepts in the pre-Socratic societies, pre-Socratic philosophy in old Greece, where the transformation of philosophical concepts deeply changed the way philosophy was done. And so in my very modest take, I'm not a great philosopher, I would think that what we have here in the 1970s, 80s is comparable to this axis age. As Achsenzeitalter. How about Pembaruan? Is this linked to Pembaruan? And here I have to say it's different in Malaysia and in Indonesia. Pembaharuan, of course, in Malaysia, but in Indonesia you have a particular phenomenon. You have the Yayasan Pembaruan, which was the publishing house of the PKI from 1950 to 66, with publications, for instance, in 1962 or 63, featuring Aidit, the chairman of the Communist Party. So Pembaruan was a flag term of the communists in Indonesia. Now, after 66, do you think it was a good idea to put Pembaruan into a book title? In Indonesia, probably not. So Pembaruan, nobody used it in book titles for about 20 years in Indonesia. Very few people. If they wanted to talk about the modern or modernization, they used modernisasi, not Pembaruan. Only in the 1980s, this old care of a ghosted word, a ghost term, became less and less. And Pembaruan, as you can see here in my graph, became used since the late 1980s, 88, about with the beginning discourse on reformasi. So you have Pembaruan in contemporary art, you have Pembaruan in literature, you have Pembaruan in Islam. The old care was no longer there after 20 years. And the peak of the use of Pembaruan were the Reformasi years. And now you have publications of Pembaruan Pesantren, Pembaruan Islam, then you have Pembaruan Agraria for land reform. So this is the old association with the Yayasan Pembaruan is gone. Nobody remembers that. However, just like with modernisasi, also Pembaruan is losing its fascination in the last 10 years. Just like the Reformasi had its peak in the late 1990s and early 2000s, ever since, there are new topics and new themes that people discuss and talk about and write about quite naturally. So we see here we have the Pembaruan and the Modernisasi all declining in the last years. Now, how about the modern? Traditional and modern. We have here a picture of Sultan Takhti Ali Shahbana, who is known together with his colleagues from Pujangga Baru for advocating embracing the modern, the new. However, you can see him, or you can put him into context of the late 1890s onward, where you have cookbooks. Buku masakan baru menunjukkan bagaimana bikinnya segala rupa makanan dan kue-kue yang enak cara Belanda, Cina, Java, Prasman, dan lain-lain sebagainya. So I have cookbooks. I have 3 or 4 in my collection from the 1890s, from the 1920s, from the 1930s, talking about new recipes, cooking recipes. And weiter also in literature, Minahasa, Lama, dan Baru from 1926. So it's not refined or limited to Java or to Sumatra. You have it all over Indonesia. And that explains why it was interesting, important for this group of intellectuals around Sultan Takhti Ali Shahbana to call their journal Pujangga Baru. You have this discourse on Lama Baru from the colonial period, Tempo Dulu, but there is not yet an idea about the process, how to get from Lama to Baru. So that's the difference to the Modernisasi discussion. The Modernisasi discussion is about based on largely on a theory how to do modernization in stages. You have to organize this first and that first and that first. So you have the state is an actor and he has to modernize things in a complicated process. Different here, the Pujangga Baru centric kind of discourse on Lama Baru talks about we're leaving the old one and we're embracing the new, just like that. So there's a difference to that. And there's another thing. I also find in the library books from the Japanese period. Sina Baru, Java Baru, Sumatra Baru, Jiva Baru. So the Japanese brought with them an ideology of Baru, calling what they did with Indonesia the Jiva Baru or the Java Baru or the Sumatra Baru. So there might be a background in the Meiji Restoration in Japan in the 1860s, where Japan was embracing the new one. So we have now a third component that we didn't see before in our discussion of why Indonesia would embrace in the 1970s Modernisasi. So we have the Western, we have the Islamic, and maybe also the Japanese background that might be overlooked. And of course, a part of the leadership of the Indonesia post-45 were allies of the Japanese and were part of this propaganda or ideology or discussion about the Baru. If Angkatan 45, 45, Khairil Anwar, quite well known. We have several publications from the late 40s, for instance, Sultan Takhti Ali Shahbana, Puisi Baru, Khairul Basri, Menuju Masyarakat Baru. The Baru did play a role, but there was, just like in the time before 42, there was not yet an idea how to get from the Lama to the Baru. That's something that is particular to the 60s. Now, we have, if you want to sum up, a distinction between Lama and Baru already as part of the discourse during the colonial era. We have the Pujangga Baru as a platform for intellectuals in the 1930s and 40s. Baru as part of the Japanese propaganda, and then the Angkatan 45, who were building a country that was new, with a new constitution. From the mid-1960s on, you have Modernisasi and Transformasi Budaya, largely influenced by the modernization theory, and important this planned development in 5 stages by Rostow. So Pembaruan then plays a role in the Reformasi discourse in the from the late 1980s on until around 2011. One should not forget the Islamic roots, Muhammad Abduh, Ahmad Dahlan, and so on. And of course, the limitations of the study is book titles are only the peak of a discourse. You have it much broader if you go to oral communication, to newspaper discourse, to other intellectual contributions. With this, I would like to thank you, and I now stop my screen sharing. So thank you.